Albion is a game that you can create builds from a plethora of items, including weapons and armor. Although you can freely choose whatever items you want to use, there are a few core ones that are a necessity to spec into when playing the game. That is exactly what I'm going to cover in this video. What are some good items that new players should spec into? I'm making this video because I've seen many players using builds like this. No judgment towards anyone who does this, it's perfectly acceptable, but builds like this aren't going to be able to compete with the many builds that are commonly used for the different activities out there. So I'm sorry if you have 120 spec on your all royal plate armor build, but that's not going to help you clear a high tier static dungeon or perform a helpful role in a small scale fight. If you're interested in making the most out of your time when playing Albion Online, then you're going to want to spec up the items that I cover in this video. I'm going to be covering each slot of equipable items besides capes, bags, consumables, and mounts because there's no spec tree for those items. In each category of equipable items, let's say for example head armor, I'll choose up to 3 different headpieces that cover almost all of the content in the game, including ganking, ZVZs, static fame farms, solo fame farms, small scale, corrupt dungeons, hellgates, roaming and fighting, and HCEs. Obviously, there are things like Ava raids, but for this video, I'm going to go ahead and just classify those under fame farms, and same with a lot of other specific content. A little disclaimer for this video is that it's going to be focused more on what you should spec into and why, rather than an explanation of what the items do. Let's go ahead and get started with the headgear. The first headpiece that you should spec into is the Royal Cowl. This cowl is commonly used in PvE contents like HCEs, group fame farms, and solo fame farms. It's also commonly used in PvP content like ZVZs, small scale, and sometimes ganking. A lot of people make the argument that the Druid Cowl is a good alternative to this helmet, which it can be in certain group fame farm situations. Druid Cowls aren't utilized in as many activities as the Royal Cowl is, and that is why it is one of the best headpieces to spec into. Since the Royal Cowl covers most, if not all, PvE content and even ZVZ and small scale content, this next helmet is going to focus more on CDs, roaming, and ganking. For the helmet, I chose a Fiend Cowl. Fiend Cowls are really effective for purging players' boots when you're trying to gank them and they run. Fiend Cowls are also used many times in 1v1s, primarily to purge Hellion jackets, Stalker jackets, and Mercenary jackets. These helmets have no purpose when it comes to PvE though. The only time that people will bring these in PvE is when they're trying to spec them up, but otherwise, once again, serve no purpose. If you put spec into these two helmets, you technically will have a helmet for every activity in the game. Now this is really going to depend on how strict your group is, but if you were to show up to a fame farm with a Royal Cowl, I don't think that the group leader is going to be too picky unless you're wearing like a Royal Cowl with some random weapon that doesn't have a mana issue, or if you were to show up to a gank session with a Fiend Cowl, the leader's not going to complain about you having a Fiend Cowl unless your group already has 3 different Fiend Cowls in it. Real quick, if you're enjoying the video, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for more Albion Online content. Let's go ahead and move on to chest pieces. The first one that we're going to be covering is the Scholar Robes. The reason being is that they're flexible for all types of content, which is exactly what we want. The Scholar Robes can be used in many different fame farm builds, including Frost builds, Crossbow builds, Arcane builds, and more. The Scholar Robes play a vital role in fame farms, ZVZs, and small-scale content, which make it an incredibly good option to start speccing into as a new player. The next chest piece that we're going to take a look at is the Hellion Jacket. These jackets are incredibly good in small scale, solo fame farms, 1vx's, small fights, sometimes even in static fame farms, ZVZs if your guilds allow it, and in roaming. This chest piece is a little bit hard to get used to, and that's why it's good to spec into early on in the game, as it is incredibly useful for lots of PvP content and should be learned sooner rather than later. These 2 chest pieces cover almost all of the content in the game. Having spec in these 2 items is essential as they will work well in many different activities. Moving on to the boots. By far, the best boots in the game are the Royal Sandals. The reason that I say that is because they're very versatile boots that can be a little bit tricky to learn at first, like the Hellion Jacket, but what they basically do is increase your damage by a significant amount, but also lower your defense. It's good to get accustomed to these boots as early on as possible because they're used in almost every single activity in Albion except for HCEs. Most often, you'll see these boots used in ZVZs, small scale, ganking, and all the different kinds of fame farm. The damage buff that these boots provide make them very sustainable in all the different content in Albion Online. In addition to the Royal Sandals, you should spec up the Hunter Shoes. These boots are very comparable as they are both very useful, but they do serve different purposes. Hunter Shoes increase your speed by a significant amount for a short duration and also increase your crowd control effects. They're really good for catching people on mounts when ganking, amazing for tanking during fame farms, as well as during ZBZs and small scale fights. Tanks tend to use these boots like crazy. Now you might be thinking, why would you spec into these boots if you're not going to be tanking? Well, the benefits that they have while ganking are definitely worth it. The reason being is you could be any melee DPS, and say you see a Swift Claw and they're in your field of view on your screen. Once you press F, you're going to immediately catch up to that Swift Claw as long as there's no objects in the way, obviously, and you'll be able to get a hit off on them. That is pretty incredible because the speed alone is very significant on these boots. Moving on to the weapons. This is the part that everyone has probably been waiting for and is most excited for. You should spec into the Permafrost. The reason being is that it's used in every single content of the game except for HCEs. The Permafrost does incredibly good damage and is not that hard to learn either. The only downfall about using it is that it can mess up boss rotations during PvE content and be annoying for the tank, but you can also use it to benefit the tank as long as you communicate with them and understand how the weapon works properly. Besides that, there isn't really much to say about the Permafrost other than that it's a really good and effective weapon to use. Another weapon that you should spec into is the light crossbow. The reason being is it's one of the biggest damage dealing weapons, if not the biggest damage dealing weapon in the game. I don't think there's a time that you could go into almost any content besides ZVZ and bring a light crossbow and the leader will be disappointed. The light crossbow doesn't have a huge learning curve, so people could pick it up and start using it pretty quickly. It's pretty self-explanatory. So far, we've covered two weapons that are very, very good for group content, and they're decent for solo content. They definitely can be used, like I said, but they're not what you're usually going to see people bringing, besides maybe the light crossbow for like solo fame farming. However, we want to look at something that is good for solo ganking and still pretty balanced with PvE as well. That weapon is going to be the Bloodletter. The Bloodletter is used in almost all contents except HCEs and usually solo fame farms. It's not very popular. However, it is very good for small scale ganking and fights. You can even sometimes have it in ZVCs depending on what your guild is going to allow. The only downfall of this weapon is that it is a little bit hard to use. The E ability executes people once their health is under 40%, which is pretty self-explanatory, but when you're actually fighting someone, you have to be able to look at their health and see, oh, are they under 40%? Is my E good to use? Otherwise, a lot of people will end up using the E before it's below 40% and end up not fully killing the person, and it ends up screwing them over. That aside, this weapon is incredibly good to spec into because it is so good at solo ganking, as well as it's incredibly good in small scale and just fights overall. This weapon is used primarily for its E ability, and the execute is incredibly powerful once it's mastered. So speccing into this weapon is a must, and if for some reason the Bloodletter just doesn't work out for you, then you at least will understand how the weapon will work versus having no spec and blindly getting executed by a Bloodletter. Let's move on to the offhands. The first offhand that you should spec into is the Crypt Candle. The reason being is that it's used in HCE, ganking, static fame farms, solo fame farms, and a lot more content. The Crypt Candle is a little bit hard to use as it decreases your defenses against mobs and players, but it is incredibly helpful to have the ability bonuses that it provides. So in other words, if you're using a weapon that you plan on mainly using the Q, W, and E for damage, then the Crypt Candle is incredibly good for that. This is usually used with static fame farm, solo fame farm, and HCE builds like the light crossbow build, but it can also be used in ganking, for example with the one-handed curse staff. The second offhand that you should spec into is the Musac. It is similar to the Crypt Candle as it increases ability damage, but it's also mainly used for the auto attack damage increase. This is used specifically in builds where you plan on doing a lot of damage with your auto attacks. Builds used mainly for PvP commonly contain this offhand, more specifically fight and ganking builds. Well, there you have it, guys. These are all the items that you should spec into as a new player. Keep in mind that this video is based off my opinion and what builds I see most commonly used. I'm not saying that these items in any way are a build, but just common items that you should definitely spec into. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Peace.